Great pleasure to be here and actually an honor. And I'm really pleased to be at this event again. I think 2019 was the last time. Do you remember pre-COVID? Now it's a time to reconnect in many ways. So I'm really happy to see friends and also to make new friends and acquaintances here around this very important topic of cybersecurity, our policies. And in this particular case, I will talk about shaping EU digital industrial policy, and focused also on cybersecurity. Now, this is work that is based upon a report, a study and analysis that I did for SARE, which is a regulatory think tank in Europe that dealt with digital industrial policy. And what is industrial policy actually? Industrial policy is the deliberate attempt of governments to orientate industrial development into specific paths. So that's a bit abstract, but industrial policy is actually also quite wide. It can consist of many, many different elements, and we'll see some of that. And what I want to make as a point here is that when nowadays we develop industrial policy, actually in many areas, but in particular in the digital area, and in particular in the cybersecurity area, we have to think geopolitics. Geopolitics not as an kind of an outcome, but actually as an input into industrial policy. And we also have to think about the different nature of digital that really puts policy development under stress. So let me use a few slides to present this to you. So why geopolitics? Well, that's kind of a well-known argument, and I think in this audience we are already saying that since a number of years, that because of international tensions, and here in particular, of course, we have been confronted with the war against Ukraine, but also international tensions that we see between the US and China, Europe and China. Think about the policy that came out yesterday about economic security in the European Union, which is very kind of geopolitics oriented. Those are tensions that put in itself already sovereignty at risk. But then we have also the digital transformation and the dominance of the digital world by a few big tech companies, which don't happen to be European. So essentially, Europeans have very little to say about it, or they need to take special measures like Digital Markets Act or others. And then also these kind of developments at a global scale that ignore anything that has to do with countries and borders and sovereignty. A pandemic, cybercrime is really global and international. But also climate change. And they all put the sovereignty of states under pressure, as Lucas Kello, who you will hear later this afternoon, calls it the sovereignty gap. So geopolitics is also really entering actually many areas of policy development, certainly also industrial policy development. Now, let me say a little bit about the different nature of digital, which challenges policy development and challenges all of us. And you might capture it in 4 S's: speed, scale, systemic, and synchrony. Well, if we talk about speed, the speed we all know, but it has been strikingly demonstrated recently with generative AI, the rise of that. So here on this diagram, you see the adoption in US households of a number of new technologies: cable TV, cellular phone, social media, and tablets going ever faster, with an adoption rate of about 5 years for social media. The adoption rate, comparative adoption rate for generative AI like ChatGPT is half a year. So accelerated by a factor of 10. And so that's speed, that's one thing to cope with. The other things to cope with is scale. We know that digital technology is really without borders and therefore challenges the geopolitical relationships, the international relationships. It's systemic. An incident, an accident, a disruption in one part of the chain can actually create a disruption across a very large area. And that's why at the time when I was still at the European Commission, we also reasoned, you know, if you got a cyber incident, you need to think immediately not the local incident, but you need to think internal market. It can be the scale of the internal market. If there's an incident in the port of Rotterdam, the whole European internal market will be disturbed. And so it's not about just localized incident management and emergency management. No, it's about keeping the integrity of the European market, and so internal market. And then there's also the synchrony aspect. And by that I mean You see in the digital world this kind of concentration of power due to network effects in, for example, cloud. But then the cloud providers have a lot of money to buy cybersecurity and integrate that. And they can do a lot, and they are also the leading providers of artificial intelligence. And they are producing and designing the most advanced chips that have that capacity. And they are now going deep into the networks, the infrastructures. So you see a number of technologies coming together, synchronous, combined at the same time, in a huge concentration of power, which we didn't see before in other industries. So that makes policy development challenging. So let me say a little bit about industrial policy. So industrial policy, I already said what it is about. This deliberate attempt to steer industrial development into a specific direction. That doesn't say very much. What is it that you want to achieve, and in which area, which industries, and what is it then that policy contains? Well, industrial policy would contain things like, for example, R&D support, investment support, market access regulation, public procurement, standards, and competition policy may be related to that, etc. And traditionally, industrial policy is actually focused at the lower level of the individual companies and how these companies are working together in an industrial ecosystem. So the traditional thing is to think about companies, and I give a number of pictures of relevant literature in this field, and the industrial ecosystem, which is really how individual companies, suppliers are working together with their related industries, with their buyers, with the input factors like capital, skills, perhaps other resources like raw materials, and of course how they work together in that ecosystem with government. Government as a buyer and government as a conditioner of the market. This is the traditional view on industrial competitiveness and has been applied a lot over the years. The Taiwan industrial policy has been developed in this way. Finnish industrial policy, Mexican industrial policy, with the help of the OECD, has been developed about this. Geopolitics is an outcome of this. It's not an input in this. It might be that then you create a dependency upon Taiwan as a consequence of Taiwan being so strong in semiconductors. But it wasn't by design, it wasn't the input. Nowadays, we say, no, geopolitics is really important because we are, for example, really worried about what is going to happen to the semiconductor industry worldwide when China steps up its aggression against Taiwan. We are confronted in Europe with export controls that are part of the industrial policy of the United States, but affect European companies like ASML. We are very concerned about the control, the weaponization of critical raw materials. So geopolitics is an entry point, is at the equal level as these other considerations when you develop industrial policy. What we are kind of missing is how does this all hang together? What is the background to this? How can you reason in geopolitical international relations terms and then derive from that what that will mean for your industrial ecosystem? How you would influence that? With whom do you collaborate? Your like-minded partners. Where do you seek the specialization efficiencies that you want to have in an industrial ecosystem without being vulnerable in an international relations perspective, without being vulnerable because of these dependencies? And which companies do you support? And should they be actually European or could they also be global, international, the debate we had just now? So, 3 levels. Let's look at how these 3 levels actually materialize. So you have the international system of states. So states are here the objects. We have the industrial ecosystem, and we have companies, firms are the objects here. And the objectives are quite different actually in these 3. As always, in policy development, you have to think about how do you marry contrasting objectives. That's the challenge of policymakers. And there are different objectives here. If you talk to the people who are in international relations, they will think quite differently from the people who are, for example, running an SME program for the competitiveness of small companies. At the company level, simplified, it's about making money, but it can also be other goals like jobs or contributing to sustainability. At the industrial ecosystem, we use words like national competitiveness. So is your industry, is your European cybersecurity industry internationally competitive? Does it have a strong position? And at the level of the international system of states, We are talking about geopolitical interest, hegemony, or dominance, or influence, or soft and hard power, or application of international law, yes or no, norms and values of state behavior. Now, if we apply this kind of thinking, in particular case, we have to take a certain industry. We could take the industry of semiconductors, for example, or cloud, or digital identity, which are the three cases that are analyzed in this report I refer to. And then you analyze what is happening in the industry along these three dimensions, and then you think about it, because we are talking about Europe, what is the EU doing? Does it have an industrial policy? Should it have an industrial policy in such an area? And how does it fit with the thinking in these three levels? So it's really important to think about these three elements and combine them, even if it is perhaps hard. Now, let me do a bit of an assessment. So I give you three examples, and they are analyzed in, especially the first one is analyzed in detail, in great detail in a report that you can read, and the others are an interpretation of this, what is happening at this moment in time. The EU Chips Act, which is about semiconductors, which is an existing initiative. EU Critical Raw Materials, which is a proposed initiative by the European Commission, legislative initiative, and EU Cybersecurity, in which there is actually no industrial policy, but a lot of other policy. So if you look at the EU Chips Act, I would contend that in that the EU Chips Act consists of a piece of regulation and a large amount of money that is made available and the bringing together of companies and a knowledge network, skills and capabilities. So it's actually quite a comprehensive type of initiative. It's actually a good example of an industrial policy initiative. It really looks at what is happening with companies and who are these companies? The large companies, the fabs that are producing the semiconductors, but also the small companies, which are perhaps the advanced designers, or that are inventing the new photonics technology, or the quantum technology that goes into quantum chips. So it really has a good analysis of that. It also has quite a good analysis of the whole industrial ecosystem. Who is dependent upon whom? And where are these companies located? And what is the role of government? And what is the role of institutes like universities? It's not so good actually in the international level. When the EU Chips Act was proposed, about 6 months later, the US came with the Chips and Science Act. And where the European Chips Act had 43 billion available, the American Act had 52 billion available in terms of investment. And soon after, China came with a 120 billion initiative. Taiwan with a much larger initiative. South Korea, Japan, with even larger initiatives in terms of money. So what did you get? Is a subsidy race. And the subsidy race is a really geopolitical manifestation. And the EU Chips Act did not anticipate the subsidy race. What do you do when you actually get into, for example, a transatlantic or another kind of like-minded subsidy race? How do you adapt? Do you have the flexibility in your initiative to react to that? Then part of the American initiative were export controls of advanced technology to China. So restrictions on exporting that type of technology, which immediately affected a number of European companies, including ASML, the large producer, the largest in the world, of advanced chips lithography machines in the Netherlands. So did you anticipate that in your industrial policy? No. The answer is no. So it is to a degree geopolitical, because it really recognizes that we will have to work together in chips with the United States and other like-minded countries, but it is not completely geopolitically prepared. If you look at the EU Critical Materials Act, that's in a very interesting case, because critical materials, you know, in Europe, there are certain materials, well, actually for many critical materials, we are very much dependent upon third countries. We are for over 95%, for example, dependent on in lithium and cobalt, etc., in foreign countries that are supplying that. And so you know immediately that this is geopolitical, because it has to come from other countries, and they are not always directly, let's say you're in the like-minded group, they may be a competitor, a rival, or what have you. And the supply of these materials can be weaponized. So the initiative actually recognizes that cooperation, international cooperation, is key in that industrial policy. It also has a reasonable analysis of the industrial ecosystem, the mining companies, the companies that are processing the critical materials, the companies that are making sure that these are delivered in bulk and the use of these critical materials. So it has a view on the industrial ecosystem and the role that governments can play. And it has initiatives that correspond to that. It doesn't provide a lot of clarity of who is whom, which are actually these companies in Europe, and which companies would you like to specifically promote in their presence, and do you perhaps need to protect them in some way or another? Do you perhaps need to help them in a way? Oh, sorry, and then finally, EU cybersecurity, and I will show the next slide for that. My assessment of the EU cybersecurity, as I already said, is kind of peculiar, because I think there is no other area in which the European Union has proposed that many initiatives as in cybersecurity. There's an NIS directive, an NIS 2 directive, a Cyber Act, a Cyber Resilience Act, a Cyber Solidarity Act, goes on and on. But despite that, there is no document that you can say this is the EU cybersecurity industrial policy. And as you just heard from the talk, there's a challenge to do that, to make sure that there's a capacity. So that gives a number of challenges. One is cybersecurity initiatives seem to be more oriented towards resilience rather than creating long-term autonomy in Europe. We don't even know when we are building up resilience whether we are buying from European suppliers or foreign suppliers, whether we are decreasing or increasing our autonomy. So the action related to that is clear. We first need to know. There's a fragmentation of priorities. We do know there are key assets in terms of critical infrastructures, but not what are our key information access assets. Intellectual property, do we protect that properly across the European Union in the same uniform way? Or for example, cybersecurity is not living in isolation. Do we make good use of other industrial policies, like for example the production of semiconductors that can provide us hardware encryption, or the production of quantum communications that can help us in the long run for cybersecurity? Do we produce that, and do we have an industrial policy for those that works back to back with cybersecurity industrial policy? So I would say it's a challenge probably to all of us to start thinking about it. How would in the future an EU cybersecurity industrial policy look like? And provide that as an item for the agenda of the next European Commission and the next European Parliament. And with that, I want to conclude and thank you very much. Thank you.